do have this year a new website, and so you'll be able to see our events quite clearly, and all events and competitions and so forth will be posted. I just want to mention a few upcoming programs before we get started today. The next Fellows Lecture will be Javier Villaflores on October 2nd at 3 o'clock, same room. And Javier will speak on perjurers, impersonators, and liars, public faith and the dark side of trust in 18th century Mexico. So I urge you to come to that. We also have a series that we're starting this year in honor of our 30th anniversary, and this series we're calling Crisis Through the Lens of the Humanities. This isn't about the crisis in the humanities, this is about how the humanities use crises. And the first program in that series will be October 24th on oil and water. And we're going to host a historian from Rutgers, Toby Jones, who's going to speak on oil and water in Saudi Arabia. So I urge you to come to that as well. Our working groups are off to a good start, and the first one will be the food studies group that will host a brown bag on September 27th, featuring Angela Odoms-Young from the nutrition department on the west side. And one of the things we're trying to do with that program is to get humanities scholars to speak with scholars in other areas as well, and just see what kinds of conversations we can get going. And Angela will be speaking on food justice initiatives in African communities. We also have two really exciting conferences coming up here at the Institute in October. One will be October 4th and 5th, and that is called Slavery and Its Aftermath in the Atlantic World, and that is in conjunction with an exhibit at the library and some very interesting documents, very unique documents that the library turns out to have about the founding of Sierra Leone. So that conference will be October 4th to 6th. And October 18th and 19th, we're going to host a conference in conjunction with the Department of French and the French Council here in Chicago called Inequality and Exclusion. This is a conference in celebration of the 300th anniversary of the birth of Rousseau and the 250th anniversary of the publication of the Social Contract. There are many other events coming up. I do urge you to watch the website, and of course we'll be sending out emails to you and brochures and so forth as well. The competition deadlines are posted on our website. We will have 6 faculty fellows for the following year, 2 dissertation fellows, and we'll again offer the LAS Humanities Research Awards. So the deadlines for those are on our website, and I urge you to tell your colleagues and make sure they know to apply. So now I would like to ask Daniel Sutherland of the Philosophy Department to come and introduce our speaker today, John Whipple.
So I'm very happy to introduce John today. John received his Ph.D. at the University of California at Irvine in 2007, and then joined the UIC department in fall of that year. His area of specialization is early modern philosophy. His focus is on fundamental metaphysical and epistemological issues in the history of philosophy, and in particular the work of Leibniz in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Though he's also worked on Descartes and Hobbes and the too frequently overlooked French philosopher Nicolas Malebranche. So John is particularly interested in causation and theories of finite substance, self-knowledge, and the relation between finite substances and God. His current research focuses on Leibniz's mature philosophy, particularly his theory of monads, his account of intra-substantial causation, and his view on creation, conservation, and concurrence. He's been unusually productive in his time at UIC. He's given numerous papers here and abroad, and he has a formidable list of publications, which include The Structure of Leibnizian Simple Substances, Hobbes on Miracles, The Dustbin Theory of Mind, A Cartesian Legacy, Self-Knowledge in Descartes and Malebranche, and other publications. He's also been productive in other ways as well, managing to sire a few children while here, so he's been quite impressively productive. And doing all that at the same time, I don't know how. I want to express as a Kant scholar the admiration I have for John's work. Leibniz is famously difficult to understand because his philosophy is deeply involved and complex. It's unusual, arcane, and abstract. But also his views evolved over time, and it's very difficult to figure out what his views at any particular time are. And in addition, he published relatively little in his lifetime compared to how much he wrote, so that Leibniz scholars must wade through endless stacks of papers attempting to piece together what his views are, both dating those texts and figuring out what can be extracted from them. So I think it takes a special fortitude to be a Leibniz scholar, and I nod to his work. So John will talk to us today about Leibniz's esoteric philosophy.
Thanks very much, Daniel, for that very generous introduction, and thank you, Sue, for having me at the Institute. I'm really happy to be here. What, at the most fundamental level, exists? One infinite substance, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, and an infinity of finite substances, immaterial mind-like entities whose only properties are perceptions and appetites. The finite substances are created ex nihilo by the infinite substance. These particular finite substances were created because they comprise the best possible world out of an infinity of possible worlds conceived by the infinite substance. Each finite substance has an infinitely complex, complete concept which specifies everything that has happened or will happen to it. You're coming to a lecture on Leibniz's Exoteric philosophy, for example, was included in your complete concept from all eternity. An individual that did not come to this lecture could not possibly be you. Nevertheless, your coming to this lecture is contingent, not necessary. It's also free. Each finite substance is created with a primitive force of action, which produces all of its successive perceptual states. There is no causal interaction between finite substances, but each finite substance represents or expresses every other finite substance in the universe with varying degrees of clarity and confusion. All of this is obviously true, right? Okay, that's more what I was expecting. So you're unlikely to respond affirmatively to that question, I gather. Words like say what, bizarre, crazy, would not be entirely unexpected. It's thus easy to sympathize with Bertrand Russell, who, after first reading the Monadology, a summary of Gottfried Leibniz's late metaphysical views, thought that he had been presented with a kind of metaphysical fairy tale, coherent perhaps, but wholly arbitrary. Leibniz faced a deep problem. He was convinced that he had discovered the metaphysical truth about the composition and organization of the universe, and he wanted to present his views to other leading intellectuals and to the general public. Yet he realized that his views were radically removed from received opinions and common sense. He took ordinary people to uncritically assume that all knowledge derives from the senses, from what one can see, touch, smell, taste, and hear. Such people also typically assume that to conceive of something is to imagine it in one way or another. Many influential scholastic and early modern philosophers constructed theories of knowledge that were in keeping with these positions. But the truths of metaphysics for Leibniz could not be sensed or imagined. They could only be conceived through reason in a purely intellectual manner. These factors gave rise to the following problem. If he presented his views in a straightforward manner to people, they would likely seem absurd or unintelligible and be subject to gross misinterpretation and swift rejection. I'll refer to this as the problem of esoteric philosophy. And one of the main theses that I want to try to defend today is that Leibniz really grapples with this problem throughout most of his philosophical career. I believe that it informs his philosophical writings to such an extent that it's impossible to accurately interpret many of them without seeing them as attempts to engage that fundamental problem. Let's distinguish three broad strategies that somebody like Leibniz might have used to deal with the problem of esoteric philosophy. And he's certainly not alone in the history of philosophy in facing this sort of problem. People like Plato and Descartes and others certainly faced it as well and dealt with it, I think, in very interesting ways, or tried to deal with it. Okay, so three different, I want to say, strategies. The first one I'll just call take it or leave it. Right? That's publish your views in a straightforward manner. Now, to the present day, certain influential Leibniz scholars assume that he's doing just this in many, if not all, of his published works. Part of the reason for this, I believe, is that they do not see the problem of esoteric philosophy as one of Leibniz's central concerns. But if Leibniz is clearly aware of this problem, then a straightforward presentation of his views does not sound like a particularly promising strategy. A number of Leibniz's own remarks about his published work suggest that it would be a mistake to read him in this way. In a 1697 letter to Placius, for example, he provocatively claims, "He who knows me only by my published writings does not know me." And in a 1702 letter to Pierre Bayle, he writes, this is the first quote on the handout, where I won't be going through all of those quotes, and usually I know how to print on both sides of the paper, but I don't know why I haven't. Okay. "I should not be in too much of a hurry to publish what I have written, the point of which was only to provide some clarification for you, sir, and for some other people, so as to receive the same in return. For I write not so much to make an impression as to investigate the truth, which is often useless and even harmful to publish, on account of the uninitiated who are incapable of appreciating it and quite capable of taking it the wrong way." Kind of a radical and striking text the first time you look at it. So texts like these have led some Leibniz commentators to conclude that Leibniz is doing something very different in his published works. Bertrand Russell, for example, famously, maybe infamously now for Leibniz scholars, but famously claimed that the difference between Leibniz's public and private writings is so significant that they effectively comprise two different philosophies: a theologically imbued fantasy designed to please royalty, and his true philosophy, derived from austere logical principles that he revealed to only a select few of his correspondents. A text like Theodicy, Essays on the Goodness of God, the Freedom of Man, and the Origin of Evil, would be a paradigmatic example of the first kind of work. This is the one philosophical book that Leibniz published during his lifetime, 1710. Okay, second possible way then of dealing with this problem of esoteric philosophy, I'll call this hidden doctrine. Conceal your views. Keep them to yourself or to a small group of people who are capable of understanding them. Provide the public with watered-down versions of your philosophy that seriously distort or even straightforwardly oppose your considered views. And you can think of various motivations one might have to do that, religious, political, or otherwise. In recent decades, Russell's view has been rejected. Nearly everyone agrees that there is more continuity between Leibniz's public and private works than Russell was willing to admit. Here, I'll quote Edwin Curly, a distinguished historian of philosophy who taught at UIC from 1983 to 1993. He says, quote, "I find the notion of a secret philosophy as applied to Leibniz implausible. It's one thing to make passing concessions to orthodoxy, and quite another to write a Theodicy. No one could compose a work so long and so dull without a very strong conviction of the truth and the importance of what he was saying." Right, ringing endorsement of the Theodicy. This is really classic Curly. That's actually not his only reason for thinking that, but it's sort of the most quotable. Although commentators rightly dismiss Russell's position, there has been a concerted effort. There has not, emphasize that, been a concerted effort to provide a thorough and appropriately nuanced account of how we should understand Leibniz's claims claim that he presents his philosophy in a popular or exoteric manner in his published works. Indeed, the trend in much of the recent secondary literature has been to minimize the significance of Leibniz's qualifications about the exoteric nature of some of his writings. I think this is a serious mistake. Today, I will argue that a more careful reading of the relevant text shows that Leibniz is utilizing a third strategy for addressing the problem of esoteric philosophy. And I'll just refer to this as pedagogy. Utilize various rhetorical and/or pedagogical strategies to move the reader step by step to a position where they can properly grasp your views. Okay, so it's a more indirect approach. Instead of just straightforwardly presenting your views, you use a variety of strategies to engage your reader at their level and then to try to bring them up to the position where they can appreciate your views. Now that's a very general statement of his strategy here, and I want to look at a lot of the particular ways that he tries to do this. So this paper is going to be divided into two main parts. In the first, I'll provide a general characterization of Leibniz's exoteric method of presentation. In the second, I'll briefly examine several ways that the method's utilized in Leibniz's Theodicy. Before proceeding, I should say a few words just very briefly about Leibniz's life and works, since I know not everyone's familiar with him. Leibniz was born in 1646 at Leipzig. His father was a professor who was a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Leipzig, died when he was 6. At a very early age, he gained access to his father's library, reading a wide range of classical authors, which supplemented his traditional education at a Latin preparatory school. He attended the universities of Leipzig and Altdorf, where he earned degrees in philosophy and law. Upon receiving his doctorate in law at Altdorf, he was invited to join the faculty. He turned this offer down, however, and accepted a position as a political advisor for the Elector of Mainz. In 1672, he was sent to Paris on a political mission. Although his political objectives were never realized, it seemed like they may have been more of an excuse to get to Paris than anything. He came in contact with some of the leading intellectuals of the age, greatly enhancing his understanding of modern philosophy and the latest developments in mathematics and the natural sciences. He would soon make original contributions to these and other fields of study. At a very young age, he was elected as an external member of the Académie des Sciences de Paris and to the Royal Society as well. He returned to Germany in 1676 following the death of his employer. He then worked under a succession of dukes at the court of Hanover in a number of capacities: engineer, librarian, diplomat, court historian, among others. Despite his rather onerous responsibilities, he engaged in extensive correspondences with intellectuals across Europe. He developed a unique philosophy, which he claimed to provide a kind of synthesis of the ancient and modern philosophies. And although he never composed a magnum opus on the order of Descartes' Meditations or Locke's essay concerning human understanding, he did publish a number of smaller articles in a book on the problem of evil, the aforementioned Theodicy. Shortly after Leibniz's death in 1716, Bernard Fontenelle wrote in his eulogy of Leibniz that, quote, "In somewhat the same way that ancients could manage simultaneously up to 8 harnessed horses, Leibniz could manage simultaneously all the sciences," end quote. Fontenelle was right about this, and he knew of only a fraction of Leibniz's work. Leibniz left behind more than 50,000 pages of work, most of it unpublished, on an astonishing range of subjects, including philosophy, mathematics, physics, astronomy, jurisprudence, theology, philology, geology, and history, and some others. Under the direction of the German Academy of the Sciences, much of this work has now been published, though it will likely take more than 100 years to complete the project of making Leibniz's corpus available in its entirety. Leibniz was viewed by his immediate successors as a deeply systematic philosopher. Certain of his texts, such as the posthumously published Monadology, were treated as important summaries of the core of his philosophy, a tightly connected system of principles and doctrines that he thought could solve many of the most profound probably all actually, of the most profound problems that faced modern philosophy. This picture of Leibniz becomes more complicated when one is faced with all of the additional texts that have gradually become available over the years, extensive correspondences, notes, and unpublished essays that were written over a 50-year plus career. Some recent commentators who have examined a wide range of these texts have argued that the very idea that Leibniz is a systematic philosopher needs to be jettisoned. Daniel Garber, perhaps the most established and influential contemporary Leibniz scholar, wrote recently, quote, "It is always tempting to ask what Leibniz really thinks, and to try to set out in clear and simple terms just what the Leibnizian philosophy amounts to. But when we look at the larger context, the full complexity of his literary remains. Leibniz comes out as a very different kind of thinker. The project of reconstructing the doctrine that Leibniz held, explicitly or under wraps, is fundamentally misguided." Much worse than merely being misguided. What we should be doing instead is trying to capture the complexity of his thought, its twists and turns, its hesitations, and its affirmations, end quote. Garber is correct in insisting that we need to look at all of the texts, not just the few that Leibniz's immediate successors had access to. He's also correct to insist that we need to be sensitive to changes in Leibniz's views over time. However, I think that Garber has taken his thesis to an implausible extreme when he suggests that Leibniz is not really a systematic philosopher and that the project of trying to reconstruct this so-called system is fundamentally misguided. Leibniz, I venture to say, would be utterly shocked by this characterization of his philosophy. As we will soon see, it's far removed from the way that he characterized his own views and writings. Leibniz saw himself as having attained stable philosophical views that were deeply systematic. He presented these views, he presented features of this system to different audiences in a variety of ways. On a surface reading, some of these presentations can seem to be presenting incompatible theses. However, once we recognize that Leibniz is using these pedagogical strategies to address the problem of esoteric philosophy, the majority of these purported tensions vanish. Sometimes I say exoteric when I mean esoteric and vice versa, so hopefully you can tell the difference. On the outline, I've included a few dates for Leibniz's philosophical writings. This is obviously not an exhaustive list, just a couple of the ones that I might have occasion to talk about from time to time. Since it would be a bit boring to start at the beginning, let's start right in the middle with Leibniz's A New System of the Nature and Communication of Substances and of the Union of the Soul and Body. This short article, published in the Journal des Savants, is the first public presentation of Leibniz's philosophy, though it was published anonymously, which is not insignificant. How does Leibniz preface the views that he presents there? So he starts out the essay like this, finally to quote two. Okay. "Finally, since some important persons have desired to see my opinions further clarified, I have risked publishing these meditations, even though they are not at all popular, nor can they be appreciated by all sorts of minds. I have decided upon this mainly to profit from the judgments of persons enlightened in these matters, since it would be too troublesome to seek out and call individually upon all those who would be disposed to give me instruction, which I shall always be glad to receive, provided that it contains the love of truth rather than a passion for preconceived opinions." Note that Leibniz claims that his meditations are not at all popular, and that many people will not be able to appreciate them. These remarks, in conjunction with the comment on preconceived opinions, are designed, I think, to encourage the reader to seriously consider the views that he will be presenting, despite the fact that they will be difficult to understand and will likely diverge, perhaps significantly, from the reader's current beliefs. Similar sentiments can be or are conveyed about a decade later in Leibniz's preface to his New Essays on Human Understanding. New Essays is a book-length examination of John Locke's famous essay concerning human understanding, written in dialogue format, Leibniz's written in dialogue format, not Locke. Leibniz intended to publish this book, but abandoned this plan when Locke died in 1704. He really wrote this book to try to get Locke to talk with him about philosophy, and didn't work, and probably wouldn't have worked even if he published it. But text 3. Although the author of the essay says hundreds of fine things which I applaud, our systems are very different. His is closer to Aristotle and mine to Plato, although each of us parts company at many points from the teachings of both of these ancient writers. He is more popular, whereas I am sometimes forced to be a little more esoteric and abstract, which is no advantage to me, particularly when writing in a living language. I take this to be a partial statement of the problem of esoteric philosophy. Leibniz's system, and note that he does speak of having a system here, is more esoteric and abstract than Locke's, which puts him at a disadvantage when it comes to presenting their respective views to the public. Another important point, which is implied by Leibniz's remarks, is that the distinction between popular and esoteric is a matter of degree. Leibniz's philosophy, even as it is presented in the new essays, is more esoteric than Locke's. This is not to say that he will be providing a full-blown esoteric presentation of his views. This point becomes clearer if we look at some additional remarks Leibniz makes about the distinction much later in the text. 4 on the handout. The ancients distinguished the exoteric or popular mode of exposition from the esoteric one, which is suitable for those who are seriously concerned to discover the truth, and that distinction is relevant here. If anyone wants to write like a mathematician in metaphysics or moral philosophy, there is nothing to prevent him from rigorously doing so. Some have announced that they would do this and have promised us mathematical demonstrations outside mathematics. But it is extremely seldom that anyone has succeeded. Yet I think that if anyone did go about it in the right way, he would have no reason to regret his labor. I have been tempted to try it myself. In this text, esoteric is being used slightly differently than it is in text 3. In text 3, he describes his philosophy as esoteric in the sense that its content is very abstract and seemingly at odds with common sense. But here, esoteric is referring to a mode of presentation. Leibniz suggests that a strictly esoteric mode of presentation would involve rigorous demonstrations closely analogous to demonstrations in mathematics. He certainly does not present his views in accordance with this method in the new essays. Leibniz does claim that it is possible to utilize the esoteric mode of exposition, and he says that he has been tempted to do it himself. Well, Leibniz had much more than a passing interest in the esoteric mode of presentation. Numerous texts, both early and late, show that he takes it to represent the ideal form of metaphysical writing. In its ideal form, it would look something like Euclid's Elements, where propositions are rigorously demonstrated on the basis of axioms and definitions. As Donald Rutherford has shown, Leibniz advocates this method in some of his early work in the 1660s and the early 1670s, and he does a significant amount of preparatory work in the form of definitional studies of key concepts in the 1680s. Although Leibniz insists in his later years that he's perfectly capable of presenting his philosophy in a strictly esoteric mode, he never does so. And this is not merely a feature of his published works. Leibniz's unpublished essays and discussions of metaphysical issues with trusted correspondents also fall well short of this ideal. As Rutherford notes, this conclusion is something of a paradox. The ideal mode of presentation in metaphysics is the geometrical method. Leibniz says he could present his philosophy in this way, but he doesn't do this despite writing extensively in metaphysics over the last 25 years of his life. Why is this? This brings us to one of the most remarkable and revealing texts in the Leibnizian corpus. I would go so far as to claim that it provides a kind of template for approaching the majority of Leibniz's philosophical writings. It consists in some unpublished remarks appended to metaphysical notes written in 1676. it's a little tricky when you look at these look at these notes. I mean, Leibniz is in Paris. He's just finishing up. He's about to leave. He's writing these metaphysical notes, and then he puts this note at the end of it. No idea that anybody's going to actually read this later on, but we do have these notes. He would never throw anything away, and I think it's really, really important. He's just being very straight here. Text 5, and I've broken this up into several parts for ease of reference, and I'll talk about them individually. A, metaphysics should be written with accurate definitions and demonstrations. This initial remark is terse, but it's almost certainly the case that he has the esoteric geometrical method in mind there. But nothing should be demonstrated in it that conflicts too much with received opinions. For thus, this metaphysics will be able to be received. End quote. These remarks imply that if metaphysics does conflict too much with received opinions, then it will not be received. Why? Well, as some of the texts like that letter to Bale that I already quoted suggest, people will regard it as absurd, summarily reject it, or misunderstand it entirely. Probably all three at once. As we have already seen, this poses a serious challenge for Leibniz, given that his mature views depart radically from received opinions. And this just is, I think, the problem of esoteric philosophy. Leibniz suggests 3 complementary strategies for dealing with this problem. Now I'm on part C of this text. If it is once approved, then afterwards, if any examine it more profoundly, they will draw the necessary consequences themselves. So in this, what I've described as C here, it's something like a surface reading meaning in a deeper meaning is what he's talking about here. And I think that we actually see this being utilized in quite a few places in Leibniz's work. He'll start with something that his readers can relate to, something like a phrase about the will being inclined but not necessitated in a discussion of the actions of finite substances. And something like that might appeal even to a reader who's, say, a libertarian about free will, but then later on, when you see what being inclined but not necessitated means, one will come to recognize that it's actually meant to be fully consistent with a completely deterministic account of the will. So there's a kind of initial way that he presents it, and then this deeper way of understanding it, once they've kind of come along a little bit and seen other parts of the system. Okay, so that's one general strategy that he utilizes, I believe. Part D of this quote, besides this, one can, as a separate undertaking, show these people later the way of reasoning about these things. Right? So again, you don't have to explain things to them all at once, right? You start with something that's a little bit more familiar, right? You might just talk about the inclining without necessitating, and not fully explain it, not provide a complete definition, for example, but then in another work, you go to a deeper level, right? And as we'll see, there's lots of evidence that Leibniz views many of his works in precisely this way, as sort of introductory or introductions to his philosophy that he wants to then supplement with something more rigorous later on. Text E. Well, the Theodicy in particular falls in that category. In this metaphysics, it will be useful for there to be added here and there the authoritative utterances of great men who have reasoned in a similar way, especially when these utterances contain something that seems to have some possible relevance to the illustration of a view. This is another strategy that you find everywhere. You find it in the Theodicy, a little too much in the Theodicy. I think this is part of what leads Curly to his analysis of that text. But it does get to what I take to be a deeper point. I mean, Leibniz is often described as an eclectic philosopher, that he really takes things from many different figures throughout the history of philosophy, and he does describe himself as a synthesizer, somebody who looks for truths buried all over the place and brings them together. And there's something true in that, but I think there's also something rather misleading in his characterization and the way that's understood, because I think the more accurate picture is, although he read extremely widely, he developed a very unique philosophy, and then he would see kind of seeds of that, or see how you could read different things of his view in what these other people have said, and so he'll bring that in and he'll cite them, even if it's not at all, or even if he doesn't affirm, what the quotation that he's getting, basically. So it's really, his eclectic, his so-called eclecticism is, I think, actually a feature of this exoteric mode of presentation, a way where people can see something familiar that they can latch onto, but which gets a deeper meaning when you look more closely. Additional tools for understanding Leibniz's exoteric method of presentation can be gleaned from some remarks in Leibniz's first philosophical work, a very opinionated preface to an edition of a book by Marius Nizzolius, written in 1670. Okay, so we're now finally back to the beginning. Started in the middle, get to the beginning. This is text 6 here. There is, however, a vast difference between modes of philosophizing. For one is, if I may so speak, esoteric, another is exoteric. The esoteric mode is that in which all things are demonstrated. The exoteric is that in which some things are said without demonstration, but they are still given confirmation by means of certain similarities and by dialectical arguments, or even by arguments based on definition but not proposed except dialectically. They're illustrated by examples and likenesses. Such a kind of speaking is indeed dogmatic or philosophical. However, it's not esoteric, that is, not most rigorous, not most exact. One point I take Leibniz to be making here is that in exoteric contexts, propositions can be treated as hypotheses rather than providing rigorous demonstrations of them. He seems to think that in certain cases his readers will be less hostile to a novel thesis if it's presented as a hypothesis than if it's presented as a thesis that can be demonstrated from metaphysical principles. And you actually see him proceeding this way in that other text that I mentioned, The New System of Nature, first public presentation of his philosophy. He presents this hypothesis of concomitance, or what came to be known as the pre-established harmony, as this hypothesis that could solve these different problems. But although he presents it there as a hypothesis, in some of his letters to other correspondents, he claims that it could be demonstrated, and he's just presenting it that way because he thinks that people are going to be able to essentially, oh, that's interesting, I'll think about that. What would it do if we adopted this hypothesis? They'll be more receptive to it. Although propositions that are presented hypothetically are not demonstrated, they can be motivated or illustrated by examples, analogies, metaphors, and stories, as he says later on in the preface. He does not, however, claim that an esoteric work cannot contain analogies, metaphors, and the like. It can include these things, which, quote, give a pleasing respite to a weary soul, end quote, so long as they are carefully distinguished from the rigorous demonstrations that form the core of the work. Leibniz notes that this difference is also observed in mathematics, where demonstrations which are rigorous and exact are carefully distinguished from scholia, in which reasoning can be treated in a more familiar manner. If we look at Leibniz's philosophical writings from the time of the Discourse on Metaphysics until his death, none of them are strictly esoteric. They all include certain features of the exoteric mode of presentation. As I've already suggested, the distinction between the esoteric and the exoteric is a matter of degree. Thus, although all of the texts contain exoteric features, some texts, such as the Monadology and Leibniz's letters to De Volder, for example, more closely approximate the esoteric ideal than texts like the Theodicy. But even this is an oversimplification, as there are varying levels of exoteric discourse in each of the texts considered individually. The Monadology, for example, includes numerous analogies, metaphors, and imaginative thought experiments alongside what I take to be more rigorous forms of abstract reasoning. With no clear-cut division between exoteric and exoteric features, it's easy to mistake exoteric illustration for esoteric argumentation. So one feature that we see here is, although we are now seeing these texts where he talks about the difference between exoteric and esoteric mode of presentation, you look at a text like the Monadology, he's not clearly distinguishing between the two. He doesn't say, now I'm going into the exoteric mode of presentation, right? These considerations are just all mixed together, so it's very easy to not really see the difference here. And as a result of that, people fasten on to some of what seem to be the most engaging and sometimes interesting things. Ooh, Leibniz just offered this thought experiment that seems to be some kind of a proof that materialism is false, right? Oh, that is Leibniz's main argument against materialism. And it sounds a lot like what contemporary people do. We like these thought experiments and this kind of thing, right? No, that's not what Leibniz is doing. That's it's an illustration. Leibniz uses those kinds of things, but it's very far from presenting, the deep reasons why he rejects materialism, for example. My general suggestion, again, is that Leibniz is utilizing analogies, metaphors, and thought experiments as tools for addressing the problem of esoteric philosophy. We need to view them as tools that Leibniz is using to help his readers gain an appreciation of esoteric truths, not as rigorous arguments for core doctrines. Although Leibniz is keenly aware of the problem of esoteric philosophy and utilizes a variety of pedagogical strategies in his efforts to overcome it, success, alas, proved elusive. Consider the reception of Leibniz's 1686 Discourse on Metaphysics, a text that some Leibniz scholars regard as the first exposition of his mature philosophy. I don't have the time to make the case here today, but I would argue that this work contains many exoteric strategies. It includes all kinds of things. It even includes sections which try to show how a basic empiricist principle about our minds being like blank tablets and all of our knowledge deriving from the senses having some truth in them, even though he really completely rejects those, rejects that view in rigor. Okay, so I think it has a lot of exoteric elements in it if you look at that work. Now, once he finished it, Leibniz sent the section headings of this work to Antoine Arnauld, a very well-regarded theologian and philosopher of the day, to see how they would be received. Right, just the section headings, but they were really like a summary of the content of it. I wish I could have seen the look on Leibniz's face when he received this response. I find in these thoughts so many things which alarm me, and which almost all men, if I am not mistaken, will find so shocking that I do not see of what use a writing can be, which apparently all the world will reject. Right? So, strike one for exoteric method of presentation here. Right? I mean, it certainly didn't work for Arnauld. Of course, that didn't stop Leibniz from trying. His usual mode is, somebody thinks his views are absurd in this way. He tries to engage them in correspondence and slowly help them appreciate and understand his views. He does this with Arnauld with very limited success, if any success at all. Just to say a little bit more about it, Arnauld singled out as an example the complete concept theory of substance. This is part of what I referenced in the little intro that I did, which he took to imply more than fatal necessity that would undermine the very possibility of human freedom. So Leibniz did attempt to assuage Arnaud's concerns, but as I mentioned, without success. It's no surprise then that Leibniz chose not to publish the discourse. It's also no surprise that the complete concept theory of substance does not make an appearance in Leibniz's first public presentation of his philosophy, the New System of 1695, that I've already referred to a couple times. And it's not that Leibniz abandoned the complete concept theory, it's just that he's come to realize that it's not the most effective way of introducing readers to his philosophical system. Right? Didn't quite work, let's try a different strategy. So, I won't really say too much about it, but the strategy he does take is, well, let's look at this big problem in early modern philosophy, the mind-body problem. And there are these different solutions to this that have been proposed. They're all problematic. Look at this new hypothesis, my hypothesis, what came to be called pre-established harmony. It solves that problem, in this marvelous sort of way, leaving all kinds of things out, all kinds of parts of the system out. So characteristically, the text of the new system itself does not indicate that Leibniz is presenting his philosophy in the exoteric mode. Right? Indeed, as we saw in text 2, Leibniz emphasizes the esoteric nature of the views he will be presenting in the text itself. Nevertheless, letters to certain of his correspondents show that he was testing the waters with this article and that he would reveal more of his system to the public if the new system was well received. To Simon Fouché, he writes, text 7, "If the public receives these meditations well, I will be encouraged to offer, in addition, some rather remarkable ideas I have for alleviating the difficulties concerning fate and contingency, and to clarify an essential distinction that can be drawn between material forms and intelligences or spirits." Right, so he wants to get to the necessity and contingency stuff, but if this goes well. It actually turns out that the stuff didn't go quite well enough to ever really get to. So continued to be a problem for Leibniz. About 10 years later, Leibniz speaks more generally about the function of his journal articles to Bernard Fontenelle. Text 8. "The true metaphysics, or philosophy, if you will, does not appear to me any less important than geometry, especially if there is also a way of introducing into it demonstrations which until now have been entirely excluded from it. However, it's necessary to prepare readers with exoteric writings. The journals have served me well until now." And so he's coming out and saying that, yes, these journal articles that I'm writing do fall within this framework of exoteric presentation. I want to look at one more text that emphasizes this general theme. This is a 1705 letter to Thomas Burnet, text 9. "I never write anything in philosophy that I do not treat by definitions and axioms, though I do not always give it that mathematical air which puts people off, for one must speak in a familiar manner to be read by ordinary people. I do not always repeat in the new pieces what I have said in the preceding ones, but I have cited them, or rather one can find them cited in Bale where I have sent people. It's better to give things in this way than to not give them at all. What I have given in these pieces is the most essential and the most solid of natural theology. I would even dare to say that I have established sufficiently in all matters of thought what is most fundamental to them, and that I no longer have any need to reason about them. Thus what you wished for me to do was already done a long time ago. I have quite satisfied myself on nearly all matters of reasoning." So modest. Here we find Leibniz emphasizing many, I think, important points. First, we still get this esoteric mode as the ideal form of presentation. Exoteric mode is more appropriate for a general audience, that he intends his various publications to serve as means of presenting a larger philosophical system. Notice that it's also implied, though, that the content of his published works isn't radically different from what he could demonstrate by means of the esoteric mode of presentation. Right? This is definitely not the kind of Russell thing where you have published works being some completely different thing. Yes, they're in the exoteric mode of presentation, but they are, somewhat informal presentations of, his core principles, right? It's also clearly implied that his failure to present his philosophy in one place as a completed system is not due to, any lack of philosophical progress, for he has quite satisfied himself on nearly all matters of reasoning, right? So it's important for us to keep in mind, Leibniz is at least saying, maybe he's bluffing. He's saying that he's, thought through these things. He does have a system. So it's not as if he hasn't constructed the system. It's just that I mean, he gives various reasons for this, for not having actually presented this work, but again, not having thought through them is not one of those reasons. I'm not going to quote in depth text 10 or 11. I just want to mention them as yet more texts where Leibniz emphasizes the systematic nature of his views. These are a couple letters to De Boss. I'll just quote parts from 10. My views certainly are connected with each other in such a way that no link can be removed without the chains being broken. And then in text 11, jumping to the very end of that, he says, my principles are such that they can hardly be separated one from another. Whoever knows one well knows them all. All right, so can it really be so crazy to think of Leibniz as a systematic philosopher if you look at the way that he actually describes his own work? Okay, I'll now focus more specifically on Leibniz's Theodicy. The title of this work was a neologism based on the Greek words for God and justice, which is a primary theme of the work. Some of the readers actually thought that Theodicy was the name of the author. Leibniz published this anonymously, again. I think it's actually, there are various reasons for him not to publish it, but I think one of the big reasons is, again, he's trying these different modes of these different strategies. As we've seen, some of them work a little bit less bad than others. But he's not sure how they're going to be received, and that's part of the reason that he's not putting his name on them to start out with. If it really goes off the rails, maybe he won't claim authorship. The subtitle of this book indicates its central themes: essays on the goodness of God, the freedom of man, and the origin of evil. His primary target in the book is the famous savant Pierre Bayle. Leibniz is particularly concerned to argue against Bayle's claims. One, that faith and reason are incompatible, and two, that the problem of evil admits of no rational solution. The text begins with a preliminary dissertation on the conformity of faith and reason, followed by the body of the work, which is divided into 3 parts. He also included several appendices, including an interesting Latin summary of the work. The rest of it's written in French, certain quotations accepted. So, over the years, the work has been subject to wildly different interpretations. One, there's the radically exoteric, right? The Russell view, which again, nobody really takes this too seriously now, but I want to mention this as one way that the Theodicy has been interpreted. It's just this kind of, theological fantasy for princes and to appease the church. Two, a different reading of the Theodicy. Right? It's a serious work, but one that bears little, if any, relation to Leibniz's theory of monads, his theory of substance. Right? The Theodicy and the monadology are largely separate projects that Leibniz pursues independently. This is a thesis that, maybe not surprising to note, that Dan Garber also defends. This is in a forthcoming work, and it's been in several drafts, so I'm not going to quote anything. In its strongest forms, he's saying, look, these are just different projects. Leibniz works on them independently. Problem of evil and all of this material, theory of substance, monads, relation between them. He's not really thinking about that. It's not important to him, and that's because he's not such a systematic philosopher. He has his attention in all these different fields, and he's just not concerned with providing some kind of overall coordination of these theses. A third, this isn't necessarily a reading of the whole Theodicy as much as a way that certain parts of the Theodicy have been used by recent scholars, and that's it's claimed that certain passages of this work provide Leibniz's most rigorous statements on key features of the theory of monads and other metaphysical topics, such as his account of counterfactuals. So obviously, the second interpretation and this one, aren't going to be exactly conducive to each other. So actually, I think that all three of these are actually problematic and not plausible as interpretations of the Theodicy. If we look carefully at the text, at the Theodicy, in light of what Leibniz says about the esoteric and exoteric modes of presentation, I think it will become clear that all three of these views are problematic. Let me begin by looking at some general comments that Leibniz makes about the place of the Theodicy in his philosophical system. So we're not yet looking at the text, but general statements he makes elsewhere about it. And in her outstanding recent biography of Leibniz, Maria Rosa Antognazza locates several texts that show that Leibniz took the Theodicy to be a preparatory work that he hoped to ultimately supplement with a more rigorous presentation of his views. In a letter to Burnet, this time in 1710, Leibniz says of this work, this is text 12, there are also scattered clarifications describing the Theodicy, what's contained in it. There are also scattered clarifications of my system of pre-established harmony and of many issues of general philosophy and natural theology where I claim that everything can be determined demonstratively and provide the means of doing so. If I were freed from my historical labors, I would like to work at establishing these elements of general philosophy and of natural theology, which include what is most important in this philosophy for both theory and practice. But this present work can serve as a forerunner together with the loose pieces which I have published in the journals of Germany, France, and Holland. All right, so he's saying that the Theodicy, it really fits in with these journal articles that he's published. None of them are presenting his philosophy in, a fully rigorous manner, but they're forerunners for this work that he hopes to provide at a later date that would be more rigorous. And again, he's seeing them obviously as connected as part of one system. This is also clear if we look at this, again, quite revealing 1710 letter to Charles Huguenin. Text 13. My essays on the goodness of God, the freedom of man, and the origin of evil have been printed in Holland, but I did not want to put my name on them. They are woven together from what I said and wrote at various times to the Queen of Prussia, who enjoyed reading Bayle, and in whose company the difficulties that he raised on these matters were often discussed. I try to explain one part of my views in a rather informal manner. As you know, some of my views cannot be presented in a straightforward manner, since people are liable to misunderstand them, not in relation to religion, which is strongly supported, but in relation to the senses. My emphasis. I am therefore thinking of a Latin work in which I will try to unfold my entire system. It's quite revealing, I believe, that Leibniz claims his views are likely to be misunderstood in relation to the senses. It suggests that the tendency people have to rely on a sensory-based theory of knowledge is the primary stumbling block that prevents them from understanding his philosophical system. This is crucial to keep in mind as we try to interpret Leibniz's Theodicy and understand its place in his philosophical system. Much of my current research has been focused on doing precisely this, attempting to determine the different ways that the exoteric mode of presentation is being utilized in the Theodicy and how this bears on the structure of his philosophical system. And it's not an easy task. As I've already noted, Leibniz doesn't typically indicate which strategies he's using are the exoteric strategies. The way to proceed, I think, is to look carefully at his treatments of particular issues in light of this general framework. I mean, you really need the general framework, which has been one of the main things I'm trying to say something about here. You need to keep all of these things he says about this mode of presentation and what he's doing in these texts in mind when we look at them and try to understand them and see what relation they bear to Leibniz's overall system. So you have to look at his treatment of these issues in light of that framework and obviously compare what he says in different texts, not just the Theodicy, but in his correspondences and notes and other things. So let me, I know I don't have too much time left, briefly mention a few exoteric features. I mean, there are some things that he mentions explicitly as exoteric in the Theodicy. So in the preface, for example, towards the end of the preface of the Theodicy, he says, quote, this is not on the handout, "I flatter myself that the small dialogue ending the essays written to oppose Bayle will give some satisfaction to those who are well pleased to see difficult but important truths set forth in an easy and familiar way." All right, so the dialogue again, and he's explicitly saying, this is a sort of an easy and familiar way to present the views, and it includes some, very interesting stories and these imagistic kind of explanations of the thesis that God chooses the best possible world. What I find interesting is that certain parts of exactly that dialogue have been taken by some people to represent some of the core, if not the core text for Leibniz's views on counterfactuals. And again, I really think that this is a mistake. I'm not going to go into that particular case in detail, but I really don't think that text bears the kind of weight that some people have wanted it to bear. Okay. And it brings to another basic point that I've also been emphasizing, this focus on the senses, on trying to reach people with sensible analogies and this kind of thing. This is one of Leibniz's most frequent strategies. These kind of analogies and images are all over the place in his writings. One recent Leibniz scholar has suggested that Leibniz has actually abandoned his sort of more a priori conception of metaphysics, and it's really, he's incorporating this empirical element into his metaphysics in his later works. Again, I don't find that particularly persuasive. It seems to me like Leibniz is recognizing that he really needs to emphasize these kinds of imagistic examples in order to draw his readers in to try to engage this problem of esoteric philosophy, right? So we find in the Theodicy, for example, analogies like this barge analogy. Okay, it's the analogy of weighted barges going down a river, and he uses this to illustrate kind of the sense in which you can think of both God and a creature contributing to the production of a particular act. So you think about the river as something like God's general concurrence, and the weight of the barge as being something intrinsic to the individual, and so the speed of that boat is due to the current, right? It comes from God, but the sort of retardation comes from the inertia of that boat. And he uses this as a kind of analogy for explaining how everything positive comes from God, and privation and limitation and sin is due to the creature itself. Okay, now that kind of analogy, it's useful for him, but it's wrong, I think, to focus on that and think that that's the core. It's supposed to be some kind of argumentative analogy for the position that he's going for, right? And this is kind of a trend, I think, in the secondary literature. You look at that kind of analogy, focus on it. What are the deficiencies? Try to come up with a more nuanced analogy. But again, kind of imagistic analogy, and not recognizing that this is only an illustration that's supposed to help people get a little bit of a grip, but he's trying to present truths that are can only be understood by pure reason, and you can't imagine them, no matter how sophisticated the analogy might be. Going back to that early description that Leibniz gave of different exoteric strategies, one again was the quotations from other authors. And as I mentioned, you find this throughout the Theodicy, and it's one of the features of it. I don't think that it was probably not that effective. I think that he really overdid it here, and instead of really, lightening the mood and bringing people in, it just seemed kind of endless and pedantic. So I don't think that was the best idea, but they're certainly there, and I think it's part of his exoteric mode. Now, some other people in the secondary literature have mentioned, though not, I think, fully developed the thesis, that Leibniz's treatment of a few particular issues in the Theodicy is more popular, it's not fully rigorous. So Robert Adams, for example, thinks that his account of necessity and contingency is not fully rigorous in the Theodicy. Donald Rutherford thinks that his remarks on mind-body union fall into that category, and Antonio Lamara thinks that Leibniz's view on the ontological status of bodies is not fully rigorous in the Theodicy. And I think that those suggestions are plausible, and I think that there are ways of developing and understanding what he says in accordance with the kind of general framework of pedagogical strategies that I've suggested. Okay, let me finish up with one more specific look at a different kind of exoteric strategy, which really pushes back against the Garber view that what he's doing in the Theodicy and his theory of substance are completely different projects and unrelated. All right, now one of the things that Garber emphasizes in trying to make that claim is, well, look, in the preface, Leibniz talks about these two labyrinths, okay, and this is text number 14. There are these two famous labyrinths where our reason very often goes astray. One concerns the great question of the free and the necessary, above all in the production and origin of evil. The other consists in the discussion of continuity and of the indivisibles, which appear to be the elements thereof, and where the consideration of the infinite must enter in. The first perplexes almost all of the human race, the other exercises philosophers only. I shall have perchance at another time an opportunity to declare myself on the second, and to point out that, for lack of a true conception of the nature of substance and matter, people have taken up false positions leading to insurmountable difficulties which should properly be applied to the overthrow of these very positions. But if the knowledge of continuity is important for speculative inquiry, that of necessity is nonetheless so for practical application, and together with the questions therewith connected, to wit, the freedom of man and the justice of God, formed the object of this treatise. So Garber looks at this text and he says, well, look, he's distinguishing between these two labyrinths, right? The labyrinth of freedom, essentially the problem of evil and all that stuff, and the labyrinth of the continuum, which requires that we go into the theory of substance and all of that. And he's saying that, these are really different labyrinths, and in this work I'm just focusing on the one. Well, I don't think that that's correct. And here, I got my numbering wrong. All right, yeah, text 15. Now here, I'm just jumping into the Theodicy later on. It's in the context of a discussion of divine conservation and thinking about whether a particular account of divine conservation undermines the causal activity of finite substances. Okay, and he sees Bayle as affirming this somewhat bizarre doctrine of continual creation, that God's conservation of the universe actually consists in this continual recreation. And Bayle thinks that seems to undermine the possibility of the causal activity of finite substances. If they're always being continually recreated by God, then how could this allow for the causal activity of finite substances? And interestingly, Leibniz kind of goes through the different things that you'd have to do in order to provide a rigorous analysis of this problem. So in text 15 here, he says, For a proper inquiry as to whether conservation is a continued creation, it would be necessary to consider the reasons whereon this dogma is founded. The difficulties on the composition of the continuum enter also into this matter. This dogma appears to resolve time into moments, whereas others regard moments and points as mere modalities of the continuum, that is, as extremities of the parts that can be assigned to it and not as constituent parts. But this is not the place for entering into that labyrinth. Right? So he ends up concluding here that, yes, I'm not going to go into the labyrinth, but he's not avoiding the labyrinth because it's not relevant. It's really because he thinks that this isn't, the right time or place for him to do that. He's saying that it is relevant. In order to provide a rigorous analysis, you have to go and do this. So here he's explicitly flagging, I think, for us that he's not providing a fully rigorous analysis in the Theodicy itself, and that if you want to do that, you have to go to you have to bring in the labyrinth of the continuum, and his theory of substance is essentially the core of his solution to the labyrinth of the continuum, right? So I think there are very central theoretical reasons for seeing the project in the Theodicy and his analysis of the problem of evil and human freedom as deeply connected with the labyrinth of the continuum and his theory of substance, right? And the reason that you're not seeing them, fully together is, again, that it's partly having to do with the nature of the Theodicy as an exoteric work, right? I mean, if we're going to take these works as all Leibniz is just laying out his views, then yeah, it's not obvious that you don't see the theory of substance playing such a central role. But again, I think that's to really miss the way that Leibniz is proceeding here. And I'm not going to go all the way through this quote, but quote number 16. Right. So after he said, well, this is what you have to do for a rigorous analysis, he says, all right, well, what he does is he essentially assumes Bayle's view. I would say, for the sake of argument, Bayle does have this, worry that continual creation undermines the causal activity of finite substances. I don't want to just not say anything about this, right? So he does provide a kind of answer to this, and he does it in text number 16. But you'll see him doing this by, saying, suppose that the creature is produced anew at each instant. Let us grant also that the instant excludes priority of time. And he goes on and says these things. I think those qualifications there, where he's saying, suppose, let us suppose, and let us grant. So he's presenting this kind of hypothetically, and it's not just because, well, he really wants to affirm this, but he's not going to provide the demonstration here, right? And that's kind of the way that he proceeded in the New System of Nature. He presents the view as a hypothesis, not because he doesn't want to affirm it, but because it's, he thinks it's going to be more accessible if he presents it as a hypothesis. Here it's more that he's presenting the hypothesis for the sake of argument, but he won't actually affirm it. And then he provides a kind of response to the problem that I won't go through in full detail here, which I don't think it's fully metaphysically rigorous, but I would argue that it does contain a kind of seed of the truth, or even more than a seed of the truth, of a kind of initial understanding of how you can see both God and the creature as contributing, as conservation, not undermining the causal activity of finite substances. But he saves a more rigorous treatment of this for another time. Okay. So, one more thing to mention about that text is this is precisely the text, and one of the texts that a number of commentators have taken to. This is Leibniz's account. This is where he's laying out, the ground floor metaphysics of divine concurrence, right here. A number of commentators have developed this in different ways and are still doing it in certain forthcoming pieces. I think that's really a mistake. If you look at what he says here about bracketing these issues, and then if you actually look at the labyrinth of the continuum, as I've argued elsewhere, where you'll see that among other things, an instantaneous state would only be an idealization it wouldn't actually be anything real. And you can see that the whole ontological framework that he's assuming in this argument, this sort of dialectical argument with Bayle, couldn't possibly have a place in his metaphysical ground floor, or in his considered account of how things work. Okay, so I think that's a little bit more tricky element to the exoteric method of presentation. Let me try to sum things up here. I've done a little bit more of providing what I hope is a useful kind of general framework of the kinds of texts and the kinds of things that Leibniz says that I really think we have to take into consideration when we look at Leibniz texts and we try to interpret them. I'm not saying that Garber is completely wrong to say that Leibniz changes his mind here and there, and that Leibniz could be contradicting himself. Not everything that Leibniz says seems consistent. But clearly, I think the exoteric mode of presentation is one of the key factors that you have to consider in trying to figure out what any Leibnizian doctrine is. And certainly all of his remarks about the systematic nature of his views and how all of these different works are supposed to be presentations of this one coherent philosophical system. It seems like we have to take that seriously when we try to interpret Leibniz. All right, let me just, I won't get into it. I don't have time to get into it, but I will say that, in looking at his treatment of particular issues in the Theodicy, it's difficult. It's very difficult, and there are a number of cases where I'm still not entirely sure whether, or the extent to which his treatment of, for example, moral and physical evil really fit within this kind of framework that I've been presenting, but I do think that it's an important framework that needs to be explored, and I hope to do that more at the Humanities Institute this year. Thanks. Yes. Javier.
Thanks. I'd say I appreciated your own exoteric.
I was supposed to be esoteric.
Well, your own efforts to make this material accessible.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
So I wanted to ask you a historical question about the problem of esoteric philosophy and to what extent you think Leibniz thought that this is historically specific, that problem is specific or takes particular form during Leibniz's lifetime. So I was thinking this is the way I'm understanding your explanation of it, the problem of esoteric philosophy has to do with the relationship between what one wants to say and one's audience. So I'm wondering, is there something particular about the kinds of things that philosophers wanted to say in this period, or something particular about the kind of audience to which they were addressing those ideas, or something specific about the mediation, the forms of communication that they're using, or maybe something specific about the period that allows them to frame that as a problem, the way that they're thinking about language or knowledge that allows them to frame in this period a problem of presentation and communication in that way.
Right. Good. So I don't think that Leibniz sees this as uniquely his own problem. Maybe he thinks that it's hardest for him. But if you look at one of the quotes that I went over very quickly was this one in the New Essays, where he's comparing his philosophy to Locke's philosophy, and he says it's kind of like Plato and Aristotle essentially. And I think there's something right about that. Aristotle's philosophy, it's much more, in general, it's more common sense. It's easier to get into it. It's more empiricistic as far as the theory of knowledge goes. Whereas somebody like Plato, if you look at his metaphysics, it's very abstract. It's not something that you can easily grasp. if you look at what he says in the Republic about these things, I mean, you might think it takes like 50 years or something for somebody to have the right preparation to be able to understand, the deepest nature of reality. And he certainly doesn't think that he can convey that to his to his audience. But I think he does certain things with some of his dialogues, like the Republic, to try to address this or try to get his readers to gain some sense of this. I'd have to turn things over to Connie to talk in detail about Plato. But Leibniz recognizes this, and he certainly doesn't think of himself as being the only one to face this. I mean, lots of the people that he's opposing, Locke, and then a lot of the medieval scholastic philosophers, did have, theories of knowledge that were, could be traced back to Aristotle, to kind of Aristotelian view. They were very much empiricist based. So, and in some ways you could see their philosophies as kind of codifying, common sense in different ways. So it's a lot easier for them, but any philosopher who does, have views that are contrary to common sense, that can't be grasped by means of kind of sensible analogies and images, it's going to be much more difficult to convey your philosophy to somebody else, right? So I don't think Leibniz sees this as uniquely his problem. I don't think there's anything about his philosophy that makes it. But yeah, if you look at the content, if you remember kind of my little pretend monologue at the beginning, right? This stuff is not close to common sense. It's a very difficult problem. And Leibniz, I really see him struggling with this in all of his, in just about everything that he wrote. And he does it in a lot of different ways, because you have a wide audience, kind of as you know. You have the kind of ordinary person, but then you have people with different philosophical backgrounds, and not everybody's going to be the same. So different things are going to be appropriate for different people. And Leibniz does this as well. He says that when he presents things in the Journal of Paris, for example, the Journal des Savants, he presents it in more Cartesian terms because his audience is more Cartesian there. When he's doing it in some of the Latin journals of Leipzig, he presents his views more in keeping with a kind of scholastic philosophy, because they're going to be more inclined to understand that kind of scholastic terminology, but as different ways in. So one of the things that I might not have emphasized too much in the presentation is that Leibniz uses these different strategies to target different people, and I think it's not always the same person that he has in mind. But I hope that helps with your question. Thanks. Connie, then Dave.
Okay, I want to maybe partly overlap with this, but then also take it in a slightly different direction. I totally agreed with you, and I think you also appealed in Extract 4, right, to the idea that with respect to ancient philosophers, you already have this esoteric, exoteric distinction that is traditionally applied to Aristotle too, right? Even if you think Aristotle's work lies nearer to common sense than Plato's, right? Aristotle's works are actually divided into esoteric and exoteric in a way that Plato's aren't, right? But still, I totally agree with you. But so then the idea seems to be something like degree of difficulty and accessibility, right? And for Plato too, I totally agree with you with that continuum idea, right? That there are some that are really accessible, and then there are others that are in between and partly pedagogic, right? And then there are others where he assumes you're already motivated, you're already brought along now, I can just do really difficult stuff, right? But here's now a question. In Plato's, it seems clear that the ones that are on the exoteric end of the continuum are lively, amusing, not too taxing. And in light of that, I'm wondering how the Theodicy,
Leibniz is just a bad stylist. He tried. I think part of it, the explanation, I think, just is that he can't write like Plato. He writes dialogue. The new.
Says about he comes along with his golden
Yeah, I mean, I think he thinks that the Theodicy is going to be, that it's going to be engaging and people are going, he puts this dialogue in.
Is it more engaging to a normal person and only dull to Ed Curly, or was it just a failure?
Well, it's mostly, well, I don't know. There's probably not a simple answer to that. I know part of the reason that it's really dull to Curly is, he's just very much opposed to many of the ideas that Leibniz is presenting. So it's just boring and not that interesting, right? But the Theodicy, it's not the only one. I mean, if you look at the new essays that he wrote, this is also supposed to be, it's clearly going to be an exoteric presentation of his views. It's in dialogue format, right? So which he thinks of as, it's a kind of classic exoteric strategy. It doesn't really work there for different reasons. I mean, there he's kind of hampered by the fact that he has to represent Locke's views. He's trying to really closely follow the thread of Locke's essays, so he always has to just come back to Locke and, to the person representing Locke, and he just kind of says what's in the text, and it just doesn't have the kind of flow. So that doesn't work. He does have some earlier dialogues, like the Confessio, which he wrote in the early 70s, that are on the problem of evil, that I think are actually better in terms of their exoteric quality, but he never chose to present them. So, I really think that he tried to make the Theodicy as accessible as he could to people, and that he wanted it to be interesting, but he also he didn't spend the kind of time that, I don't know how much time, obviously Plato spent on the Republic, but however much, it's just for me it's a masterpiece just crafted in this beautiful, amazing way. The Theodicy, it doesn't really rise to that level. It's based on these notes that he has with Princess Sophie, or Queen Sophie Charlotte at this point. And, he takes these notes and he incorporates a number of additional quotations and things and makes them into a work, but it's just, it's repetitive in different ways. And this isn't a huge advertisement for the Theodicy, I realize, but, but he just, with all of the things that he was working on, he didn't have, I think, the time to really do this. And I think he didn't have those kinds of skills that Plato had, and it,
By the way, is there any way of knowing whether he thought, as I just assumed, that some of Plato's works were the esoteric ones and others were the exoteric, or did he perhaps think, like the English Liveness people, that all of Plato's works are the exoteric ones and the esoteric stuff was his oral tradition?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Maybe he could have thought, well, his are like, the Timaeus and the laws or something, right?
Yeah, I don't know of a place where he's really explicit about that, or where he, yeah.
But presumably you, with your pedagogic thing, were thinking like me, that it's within the corpus that we have that you can establish these two poles of more or less pedagogic.
Right. Although I don't want to get into a debate about Plato with you, but yeah, I would say nothing really gets similar to the,
achieving this, if he thought that all of Plato's dialogues were exoteric, and he was emulating the ones like the Philemus, the Timaeus, the laws, which you could even think are more serious than stuff like the comedies.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Kyle. Dave, and then Daniel.
So I'm just trying to kind of wrap my mind around this esoteric and exoteric thing. So as you know, the problem of audience reception was something that concerned a lot of early modern philosophers. Right? So Berkeley publishes the principles, decides everybody despises it, and then represents it in the dialogues. And then Hume writes the treatise, and later tries to pretend he didn't actually write it. Not literally, but says he wished he could have. But it's not like and then he represents the material in other forms. But they don't conceptualize this as, oh, there's the real thing, and then there's the presented one, right? They conceptualize these cases, they're trying to present it to an audience in an understandable way, and they messed up. And then they have to do it again, because the first one was defective, right? So the one that nobody understands is not the truth or the right thing, it's just the failed attempt, right? So for Hume, it wasn't that when he disowns the treatise, what he disowns about it is its unreadability, right? It's not the philosophical doctrines he's rejecting, and when he rewrites it, it's not that he says, oh, and if you really want to know what I think, go back and look at the treatise. He does not have that attitude. He's got the other attitude. Nobody should ever look at the treatise. That's his attitude, right? And Berkeley, it's not like he says, oh yeah, the real truth is in the principles. You know, if you want to know what I really want to think, you should look there. Rather, these works that had difficulty with perception were just failures. Right, and so I'm just, Leibniz seems, did he write the one that presented the real truth?
No.
Yeah. So I'm a little.
That's
what's special about Leibniz? Because all these guys, they do realize, oh, the stuff I'm saying is radical and difficult, and people are going to have trouble understanding it and giving their preconceptions. I don't think there's actually any. Empiricism, I don't think, has any special claim on the ordinary mind. At least not the kinds of empiricism that these early modern guys were pitching. And so it sounds like, so what's different in the esoteric thing other than sometimes you have more concern with a broader audience and sometimes you have less? Or is it just that?
Well, I mean, what you have in...
Because it's not like you're ever writing for no audience.
Right.
And maybe Leibniz had this idea you could write such a book, but I'll just observe he failed to produce it.
Well, yeah, you're always writing for someone. I mean, for one thing, Leibniz has, when he's talking about the esoteric mode of presentation, I mean, he has something in mind that Hume and Berkeley don't have in mind, of a very closely kind of geometrical presentation of the views, where you would start with. I mean, he has some really incredibly ambitious ideas about how it would work, where you would get like these primitive concepts and various rules for combining those concepts, and it'd be like a kind of alphabet of human thought. You'd be able to get the structure of concepts and propositions that would mirror the structure of reality. The special philosophical language that's different from ordinary language, that doesn't have any of those ambiguities, right? I mean, so at different points he thinks of that as this kind of radical ideal of what you would have for like a pure metaphysics. And he obviously doesn't get that, but then I think there are these different things that would be closer to that, right? So I think I'm partly missing your point. I mean, you can. I think in debating somebody like Hume, I mean, if you're thinking of conceivability in terms of imaginability, for example, I mean, Leibniz sees that as much. That's a lot of people think something like that, and Hume's going to be able to use that to his advantage. But Leibniz thinks that that's fundamentally, I mean, that's a bad view of conceivability, and your metaphysics is going to be all messed up if you have this, right? So I think it's a lot more difficult for Leibniz to present his views. I mean, you're right that I think pretty much all the early modern philosophers faced some kind of problem of sort of audience reception. I think for Leibniz it was very acute, and I also think that I think somebody like Locke, he was misunderstood by lots of people, but a lot of people got his basic view in a way that was reasonably good. Not so sure maybe about Hume, but I'm not convinced that Leibniz thought that he really succeeded in very many ways at all with his philosophy. I mean, I think he, so in terms of, I mean, he didn't think his works were complete failures. You know, he wouldn't keep referring people back to these works if he thought that they didn't work at all. He thought that they could work, and he kept trying to supplement in ways that you know, would make it more effective for people. But you know, my sense is that he didn't think that enough people were far enough along in his philosophy for it to be worthwhile or useful. It would actually be counterproductive for him to just, you know, lay it out in the most esoteric way that he could. I'm not sure how well that addresses. I think we should talk more about it. But thanks, Dave.
Right.
Oh,
You want to take one more?
Daniel. Okay.
Well,
Is
I
it-
think
was it
Dave's
long?
question. Sorry.
Yeah.
So I think Dave's question actually really is a good one, and I think your response goes along the lines of the question I was going to ask, which is the nature of Leibniz's conception of the esoteric philosophy. And it looks like it does have to do with a radically different method of presentation, but also perhaps leading to radically different results than one might expect that might be unsettling and so on, right? But I wanted to ask a bit more about the character of the esoteric philosophy, and you mentioned that the presentations it's a matter of degree, it's not absolute, but the ideal of the esoteric philosophy, your mention, and Leibniz mentions that you're going to start with definitions, he says sometimes axioms,
Right.
and demonstrations, though one place he just says definitions and demonstrations, which I think is interesting. But then the distinction itself is between esoteric and so exoteric and esoteric, where the word is acromatic, which is really a term about demonstration, a form of demonstration. Looks like it would be geometrical as well. But that one comment I thought was really interesting in the introduction, the preface to the new essays, where he says, I was forced to be a little more esoteric and abstract, which is no advantage to me, particularly when writing a living language. You know, so the first thought is, oh yeah. If only I were writing in Latin, then I'd be better off. But he doesn't have that in mind at all. He has the universal characteristic in mind, which is part of your answer. So the ideal isn't just that you do it in the more geometrico, you set up some definitions, you go. You have to actually have a completely different language that's going to express the content of the concepts and the relationships between them. Now it looks like what counts as esoteric, this ideal, is something that Leibniz not only never actually practices, but doesn't even come close to practicing.
Yeah.
And
there are theoretical reasons why he wasn't able to do that. But
right.
Yeah.
So the ideal of an esoteric philosophy, you know, there's this degree of presentation.
Right.
He's very far from it, which leads me to think that maybe, I think I was picking up on a comment you said at one point, there is some bluffing on his part, right? He says, you know, in the quote on 9, I think is the strongest formulation of it. I never write anything in philosophy that I do not treat by definitions and axioms, but I do not always give it that mathematical air which puts people off. So this is going to lead me to a question, but it's interesting that in the quote on 6, he actually says that the exoteric presentation also uses, even by arguments based on definitions. So you can use arguments and definition even the esoteric. So it really is a matter of degree here, right? So it looks like to be esoteric, you really have to be getting at the fundamental definitions using the universal characteristic or something.
Yeah, that's
Maybe he's kind of bluffing a bit.
No, a little bit. But if you look at these texts, he has different things in mind. He's not always thinking of the universal characteristic. In some of these texts, he is thinking of that. That's the way that he originally thought of it.
Yeah.
But if you look at these texts where he does talk about, you know, well, I have said all these things, they're preparatory works, and I'm hoping to do this. I mean, you look at, a number of these. He says, I'm looking to do this in. He says some of these texts in Latin, right? He's looking to write. Let me find one of the texts where he says that. Yeah, like this text 13, right? I'm thinking of a Latin work in which I would try to unfold my entire system, right? So, he's come to something more modest where you wouldn't necessarily get, purely like primitive definitions, but it would be like a refined Latin language with, that would.
So it'd be like Spinoza or something.
Yeah, it'd be closer to something like Spinoza. So I think that he, you know, in the end, he doesn't think that what he could present is the strict esoteric, you know, presentation with the universal characteristic, but he could present it in something closer to, you know, the Spinoza's version of more geometrico.
Okay, but that's about what he could present it in, right? But there's this further question about how much of it he's been able to do himself. So this leads up to the question. So
well, he hasn't actually. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, are there texts in which you see him starting with definitions and pulling things? And I think the answer, is some, because I've seen it. I've seen some of it in the mathematics, but
yeah, he did a little bit.
Substantial amount of work of that sort, or is it more just this idea that
Not
this
really.
would ideally be the way to do it, and he never really
Yeah,
makes
I mean,
it
he doesn't get very far in actually laying it out. I mean, he does a lot of these definitional studies, especially in the 1680s, of key terms that would figure in that. Though again, they're not primitive definitions, you know, but they're just these kind of definitions that could work. I mean, they could fit into something closer to like, you know, more like a Spinozistic account of the more geometrical. So I do believe that there is some amount of sort of bluffing on Leibniz's part as far as you know, what he could do, right?
Yeah,
but if you think, even if, I mean, even I would say further, you know, even below a sort of like presented in the geometrical model, I mean, something like just spelling out in clear terms without metaphors and analogies what exactly his views amount to. He doesn't even do that. And that I think he definitely could do, and that you can get that from, I think, looking at the text and triangulating in various ways. But you're right, on all the way to the pure esoteric is ultimately a bit of a pipe dream for him.
It doesn't appear in the manuscripts that much.
No.
I mean, this actually, what's interesting, there's an interesting parallel, or actually maybe an instance, not a parallel to it, in Leibniz's treatment of, if you wanted to give a new foundations to Euclidean geometry, it was going to be radically better. Throw away Euclid, everyone's going to do Leibniz's geometry after this. He develops what he calls the analysis situs, which actually has two approaches, which he both sells to people in letters under the title analysis, but they're actually incompatible. One of them doesn't go very far at all. The other one is actually really fascinating. Sends a letter to Haupen saying, I can prove something in 4 steps that it takes Euclid 3 books to prove. Isn't this a wonderful system? And it is sad because it's like his reception from Arnaud or something. Haupen writes back and says, well, okay, nice little trick here, but you know, I don't really see where this is going to go, and Leibniz drops it. And it's really sad because it's really interesting. But the bottom line is that he makes it sound as if, you know, this is, you know, this is wonderful, it'll open up everything. He gets a little piece and then he doesn't have time to develop it, and there's a lot of bluffing involved. So.
Yeah, he gets a few bluffs in here and there. Thanks, Daniel.
Well, I'd like to invite everyone to continue this conversation and a reception out in the main room, and to thank John.
Thanks.